Hello everybody, I hope you're all having an amazing day. Today is Wednesday and that means we're going to be doing a little lesson here, and I figured today we could look at some pawn structures. Now I know what you're thinking, pawn structures are so boring, I would much rather do puzzles, I'd much rather do opening theory, but I guarantee you if you spend a bit of time on this and actually go 100% on it and dedicate yourself to a bit of study on this, it will benefit you way more in the long term than any piece of opening theory could possibly benefit you. I know this personally myself. When I was about 13-1400, I often got into the middle game after doing a really good opening and I sort of felt lost. I wasn't particularly sure what to do, what my plan was, and after I did a bit of pawn structure analysis, I suddenly became way more confident going into the middle game. I knew what my plan was in the long run, not just the middle game, but going into the end game as well. And that just helped me win so many more games, not only because I knew what the right plan was, but I was just way more confident as well. So please give it a go, give it a shot. I guarantee you it will help you so much, even though it is kind of tedious. But yeah, please just give it a shot. So I've got 8 sort of what I think are the most common sort of pawn structures you'll get, and we're going to be going over how they sort of relate to your plan coming out of the opening, sort of what openings they come from and what the plan is going forward from there. And we're going to be sort of starting with the d4 openings and going on to sort of like moving on to the e4 sort of stuff. And we're doing it that way just because I feel like the d4 openings are a bit more positional and require a bit more nuance to them, rather than the e4, which sort of end up in a few trades. So yeah, let's just hop in straight to the first pawn structure. So the first pawn structure we have here, it's by far the most common structure you will see going into your games, especially if you play like a Queen's Gambit style thing. It's the isolated queen pawn. Now this can also work for the isolated king pawn, but it's just not as common. So the isolated queen pawn is what everyone calls it, and it's probably the most studied thing in chess, just because of how common it is. There's so much research on it, so many studies on it, so many videos on it. Apologies if you have heard some of this before, but it is super important, especially important to know how both sides should play this pawn structure. So starting off with white here, and what you want to focus on is keeping the pieces on the board as much as you can. You want to keep away from the end game if possible, purely because there are no pawns defending this one. There's no pawn chain on either side, so it cannot be defended. So the king is just going to come straight ahead and target this in an end game. So you want to keep the pieces on as much as possible. And you want to really be going for a king attack, and try weaken their kingside pawns as much as possible and potentially win some material. So the pawn breaks for the white side, you sort of have 3. Potentially you have this d5 move, which ideally you would just trade off the isolated queen pawn, but you could potentially sacrifice the pawn. If you have some sort of attack here, maybe you have a fianchettoed bishop on b2. Maybe you have a bishop on c2 as well with a queen on d3, looking at these pawns here. And yeah, you're going to do that to potentially try trade off the isolated queen pawn if you're heading into an endgame to get rid of that weakness, or if you're going to be launching a big attack. The other one is potentially an f4, f5 idea, just to get rid of this pawn here that's sort of blocking your passed pawn, and potentially make some weaknesses, especially if you have a rook on the e-file. And the last one is going along with the theme of launching an attack on the black king, is the h4, h5, and is not really because of the pawn, but it's just continuing with that idea of launching an attack, weakening their pawns for your strong bishops on these diagonals. It's also important to note that there is an open file here, so black's going to be trying to exploit that. So you have to take care of that as you see fit, because there's no, especially when we're looking at the board without the pieces, there's no sort of set rule on whether that's good or bad for white. It just depends on the situation, but it is something to be aware of. And now the ideas for black, which are pretty much the opposite. You want to be trading off your pieces as much as possible to enhance the weakness of this, because the longer the game goes on and the more it goes into an end game, the more this pawn becomes a weakness. So you want to be trading off. The other thing you want to do is blockade this pawn as much as possible. Now, ideally you would be doing this with a knight, simply because if the knight gets kicked away, it's still defending that square as well. So you can do it with a knight, ideally, but I think a bishop could also work, maybe a rook could also work as well. But just stop them pushing this pawn, stop them trading it off if possible, and try trade off the pieces as well. Usually in the end game, this is going to be a massive weakness, so you want to be targeting that as soon as possible. Or you could just try to win it outright. Maybe you've got some b6 ideas with a fianchetto, looking at this sort of kingside pawn here. So that could be a good target if you've got a queen on d5 as well. Or you could do like an a6 b5 idea with a bishop coming on this diagonal here, looking at this pawn as well. So you've got lots of ideas. You either want to win this pawn or you want to blockade it. But either way for you, trading off pieces is going to be sort of your goal. You're not really looking at any pawn breaks, simply because this pawn's doing an amazing job just blockading it as it is. You also want to be defending the kingside attacks as much as possible, and just making sure you're not getting checkmated, basically. But that's basically it for the isolated queen pawn. Obviously, there is a lot of nuance to this. If you want to learn more, just have a look at games. There are so many masters games with the isolated queen pawn, and you'll get a good idea of how they sort of go about handling it, which is way more than I could ever get across in this video. But yeah, let's head on to the next one. So the next pawn structure we're looking at also comes about from the Queen's Gambit, and this is going to be like a Slav, semi-Slav sort of setup with these two pawns here. However, you'll notice that this pawn isn't isolated, so it's basically the same thing, but these two pawns are here instead. Now, because of that, this is actually a very strong pawn. It's stopping the open file here, and black has their own similar pawn with this one here. So, how do you go about playing this? Now, unlike the isolated queen pawn, it's completely sort of fine to trade things off, obviously depending on what the situation calls for. But generally, black's going to be the one who's going to be going for the pawn breaks. Black has either sort of pawn break, depending on the situation, but the C pawn break is generally going to be the one they go for. They want to be getting their sort of rooks on this C file and looking for the pawn break, trying to make a really strong open file for their rooks. Now, on the other hand, white could potentially go for a minority attack. Now, if you don't know what a minority attack is, it's basically an attack where you have less pawns than your opponent. And it's super dangerous, actually, because it's the style you do it is almost sort of reckless, and you're just looking to make long-term weaknesses, really. So potentially you have a b4, b5 idea, which is super crazy, potentially sacrificing the pawn. But the weaknesses you make, especially if you play like an a4 supporting it, the weaknesses you're going to make are going to be lasting way longer than what the pawns are worth doing there. So yeah, a c5 for black, a b4 for white. Obviously castles are both going to be kingside. I don't think anyone in their right mind is going to be castling queenside in this, although it could probably be better for white than for black than for white, but still it's going to be a kingside sort of thing. And it's important to note here that unlike the isolated queen pawn, white doesn't have these strong dark square diagonals anymore, which means it's going to be a lot less of an attacking game, especially on the king side for white. So all the play is going to be about basically this queenside and seeing who can do it first and who can do it the strongest as well. So you're going to be wanting to get your pieces looking over to this side and just trying to break through basically, because not much is really going to be happening on the king side. So it's super solid for both players. Maybe if white plays something like a b5, if black plays something like a b5, white's going to have this really strong outpost on c5 for a knight or something. But after like an a4, a5, maybe like a b6 as well, that's going to be covered really well, and it's going to be supporting the c5 push for black as well. So yeah, that's basically it for the Slav. It's a pretty simple one. But again, it's going to be all depending on what the pieces are saying, really. How they're impacting the pawn pushes and the pawn breaks, and especially this open file that could potentially happen. But yeah, on to the next one. Now, the next pawn structure we have is called the Carlsbad, and it comes when the pawns are sort of connected like this. And because of how the pawn chains are sort of against each other, there's not going to be many pawn breaks in this situation. Potentially there are some, depending on tactics, but usually any pawn break is going to leave you with some sort of isolated pawn, which is not what you really want in this sort of situation. So basically that leaves us with one option left, and that's a wing attack basically. So I reckon both sides would probably castle kingside here, and white's going to be playing with this minority attack, similar to the Slav that we've just seen as well. Because it's so solid in the center, the only way forward is really to break through on the sides. So white's going to be going with this b4, b5 idea, potentially supported by an a4 as well. They're going to be wanting to get their bishops looking at this diagonal, because they can't really go across their pawns like this. Potentially you can with the light squares, but with the dark squares, they're solid as a rock. They're not going anywhere. Potentially, black has like a c5 break, but again, it's not particularly solid unless there is a tactical reason. But the minority attack for white is definitely the way to go with this one. The plan for black, definitely again going to be kingside castling, but you see this diagonal here, that's going to be going for the kingside. So the idea for black is very much to survive the minority attack, keep everything locked up, and launch all their pieces onto the kingside looking for a checkmate and attack. Potentially have some h5, h4 ideas as well, with ideas of a rook lift as well. Now, if you don't know what a rook lift is, it is quite an interesting idea. You don't see it all too often, but it's always a serious threat. It's basically after you castle, in fact you don't even need to castle really, but it involves spending a couple moves to get your rooks in front of the attack, where they can actually threaten to do some damage, and it's super powerful if you can pull it off, but because it takes maybe 3 or 4 moves to do, it comes with the risk of losing time, especially when you are facing a dangerous minority attack. So the key points: definitely don't be pushing any of these pawns, however tempting it looks, unless you have some very concrete tactical ideas. White is going for this. Black's going to try absorb these the best they can, try lock it up, and then put all their pieces facing the king, looking for a checkmate and attack. But again, just a very solid pawn structure. There's not much to it. Just try do some damage, basically. And yeah, on to the next one. This next pawn structure we have, it's probably the next most famous one after the isolated queen pawn. And you might have heard of it before. It's called hanging pawns. And the reason it's called hanging pawns is because both these pawns don't have anything defending them. Now you actually play this quite similar to the isolated queen pawn. They're sort of related to each other, But basically, black's trying to make weaknesses, and white's trying to not allow those weaknesses. So again, both players going to be castling kingside. And for white, the idea is during the middle game, you want to be taking advantage of all of this central control that you have with these pawns. You want to be using the open diagonals to sort of attack the king, but eventually you are going to have to make some commitment with one of these pawns. Now, whichever one of these pawns you push with, you've got to be really careful, and it's very situation dependent, but usually it is going to be the D pawn, just because it's closer to the center, which means your pieces are going to be more active while they're attacking and defending. So it's usually going to be some sort of D pawn, and you either end up with an isolated pawn, or they're going to push, and this pawn's going to become weak. And like if you push with the C pawn as well, this pawn's going to be weak as a backwards pawn. So you've got to be ready to push, and you've got to be ready to defend this pawn as well. So after you've done that, you're not particularly threatening to push the pass pawn unless your opponent allows it. But you're just going to be constantly sort of threatening to push it, basically. And you've got to have your pieces ready to support that push at any time as well. So the plan for black is sort of actually the same thing. You want to make them push, but you want to make them push when they're not ready for it. So because both of these are so weak, you can easily provoke weaknesses with them. With your rooks, ideally. And if they're not ready, they're going to sort of be forced to push one of these pawns. And if they push it when they're not ready, then especially the backwards pawn is going to be super, super, super weak. So sort of both players want to put their rooks on the open files. And depending on which one of these pawns sort of pushes, you want to be ready to attack or defend the other one, basically. Black also has this really cool trick of going e5 straight away, potentially even sacrificing this pawn to weaken all of these and have some easy targets in the endgame. But obviously that comes with its own risks as well. But after an e5, say you've played like an f6 anyway, and they go there, it's just another way of inducing these weaknesses into the position. You don't really want to be doing with the b pawn, just because you sort of like these two here, stopping the pushes and stopping this a pawn, doing what it wants as well. So again, it's a super piece heavy position, super piece heavy structure that relies on your pieces to defend your pawns, especially the weak backwards pawn. And it's probably better for black if they trade off the pieces. So you want to be, as white, keeping the pieces on the board, and as black you sort of want to be trading off so your king can sort of infiltrate in the endgame. But yeah, it's super important to know this. It can come from the usual sort of Queen's Gambit setup. It can potentially come from sort of like a Sicilian as well. But yeah, it's super important to know because it can easily become a weakness for white, especially if they push the pawn when they're not ready. But yeah, onto the next one. So the pawn structure we have here, it's known as the stone wall. And you can see here, it's a super interesting sort of shape we have here. And you might be noticing straight away the holes on these two squares. And if you are, congratulations, you're a genius. And it just shows how sort of piece heavy this is going to be. So immediately we don't see any sort of breaks on either of these sides. It's super solid for both. And this structure is not really going anywhere anytime soon. So it's going to be a very piece heavy structure, and we have to know how to use these pieces properly. So for white, well, it's actually sort of the same for both players really because of how symmetrical it is. So you want to be using these sort of holes the best you can, really. They're going to be sort of focusing on your knights. So you want to get a knight into your opponent's sort of hole, really. That sounds wrong, but say you've got a knight to f3, both players, or a knight to f6. This one's going to be hopping in here. This one's going to be hopping in here. And usually you're going to be having a bishop on one of these squares as well. So we know from closed structures that bishops don't really do well. So ideally, we want to be trading off one of these bad bishops. For black, it would be the white square's bishop in this scenario, and for black, it would be the dark square bishop in this scenario. So you want to be trading off your worst bishop for one of their knights, ideally. Now, if you manage to do this, black's going to have a choice of which way they want to be taking after you've taken their knight that's entered into your territory. Now, they can take either way, and either way is usually fine. It sort of depends on what the situation calls for, whether there's a rook on either of these files. But either way is fine. Now, if yours is also in their territory and they decide to take, you're generally going to be in a better position. And it's a bit confusing because it looks exactly the same. But after they've taken, and this pawn's no longer here, you have a choice basically. You can either keep the position sort of locked up by doing the opposite, and this pawn's no longer going to be there, and they're going to be on these two squares. So you've still got pawns blocking the open files, or you can choose to take with this pawn, sort of creating open files. So if your rooks are more powerful on this one, then you're going to be sort of wanting to open up the file. So you're going to be wanting to take the same side they've taken. But if their rooks are super powerful on this file, then potentially you want to keep it closed with taking the opposite way. So that's a super important thing to sort of note, and it's where this position gets really sort of subtle. There are a few traps in this position as well. Say if you have knights on both of these squares where you normally develop to, and you have a bishop here. They have a knight that comes in. If you go ahead and take with this knight, and they take with the pawn, they're going to be forking both of these squares. So it is important to just bear that in mind as well, especially for beginners. It's happened to me a ton back when I was first sort of encountering this sort of structure. But yeah, it is something to note as well. But it's a super interesting sort of structure, and it's really interesting to see how higher rated players sort of deal with it. So I would definitely encourage you guys to go check that out for yourselves. There's way more than I can mention in this quick little video, but yeah, definitely go check it out, please. It's super interesting. And yeah, onto the next one. So we're here now with the next pawn structure, and this one's called the Maroczy. Now this is also a super famous one, and it can sort of come up from both e4 and d4 openings, but you'd probably most likely encounter it from sort of a Sicilian type, almost like a dragon opening after a d4, and then like a takes, you know, and then a knight picks it up, and then you play like a c4, something along those lines. And it's a really super interesting one, super sort of dynamic. So again, it's probably going to be both a kingside castle, and for white, you have a ton of things you can do really that sort of depend on what your pieces are sort of covering really. The first one we can see straight away is going to be a c5. Now this is a super interesting one. If you have sort of good control over the C and D files, this one might be a good option. Obviously if they take, you're going to be sort of controlling the D file straight away. But if they potentially have like a d6, it's a quick way to sort of stop this one. And then you're going to be needing to take this pawn afterwards as well, because there is no b4 unless you've played a b4 already. So b4, c5 is looking super strong, and that's a great way to sort of weaken this little pawn chain they've got going on, is with the c5 push. It's important to note that there's a little hole here, so if you can potentially get a knight on this square, this knight could be super powerful. However, again, it could be easily kicked out with an e6. The other sort of pawn break you have going for you as white is an e5 push, and that's very similar as well, although it's keeping the sort of majority on the queen side of the board with the 3 versus 2. Now this one's a bit dubious as well, because you've got nothing directly supporting it. You're going to need like a knight on f3, or potentially like a bishop on one of these two squares. You could potentially play an f4 to cover this, but again, this makes this diagonal very strong for black as well. So this one's not quite as common, but it still could be good, especially if you want to keep this majority on the queen side. Now the last one we have here for white is actually going to be an f4, f5 sort of thing, and that's just sort of stopping this e6 push, making this knight outpost even stronger. Like we said, this diagonal is going to be super weak if you go for the f4. However, it does also launch into potentially an f6, maybe going after the king like that as well. With f4 as well, you are launching with e5 potentially as well. So a lot of super interesting ideas for white, and it sort of gives white a bit of the initiative if black doesn't potentially know what they're doing to sort of cover against these pushes. So for black here, you might see it already, but the sort of main idea is going to be this minority attack on the queen side with the 3 versus 2. And in a lot of these pawn structures, you can see how important minority attacks are. And it's something I can potentially cover in the future as well. I must admit I don't know much about it. I've never particularly been in situations where I'm confident enough to do a minority attack. But it's definitely something I can research if you guys are sort of curious. You also sort of want to take advantage of this open file if the chance arises. If they are going for the c5 push, you want to make sure you're covering both of these files and covering them well as well, because that can be super scary for black if you're not. Like we said, looking at the white side as well, this e6 pawn push is potentially super strong, with ideas of d5 or just covering any sort of pushes they want to do as well. E6 is a great idea. It'll get your bishop onto a relatively good square, and then d5 is just going to be quite good, and it might potentially end up with an isolated pawn for white, which, knowing what you know now, you know how to deal with. There are potentially some ideas with f5. I would not really recommend this. This light square diagonal is going to be quite strong, especially if they play like a c5, and it's just not particularly necessary. You're better off sort of sticking your play to the queen side here rather than going for a super strong, not super dedicated attack, let's say, on the king side. It's just a bit unnecessary. But that's the Maroczy. There's a ton of sort of studies on this, so definitely check this out for yourself. And it's really dynamic and can go sort of various different ways, depending on sort of what you want from it, really. So it's important to sort of know how you like to play before you sort of go into this one, and then that sort of impacts your choice on what sort of pawn breaks you're looking for. But yeah, on to the next one. Now, this pawn structure we have here, you'll know it straight away. It comes from the advanced French, and it's a super simple one. If you play the French as well, you'll probably know this one inside out, because a lot of the theory in the French revolves around pawn breaks and how to sort of weaken each side's pawns. But yeah, it's pretty simple. Black's looking at taking this, and white wants to make sure this is safe, basically. Both sides, again, kingside castling, because of the weaknesses on the c-file especially. And you can see there is, again, some strong diagonals on here. So that sort of locks both sides to each half of their board. So white's sort of looking for an attack on the king side because they can't particularly play super strong on the queen side because of this wall, this pawn chain. So white's sort of looking at attacking the black king. They want to obviously be covering their pawn at the same time, and they want to be making sure they're controlling the c-file when it eventually opens, because it will eventually open. And black's sort of just doing the opposite. They want to defend the kingside attack, obviously, and they want to be advancing these as much as possible, really, and making counterplay on the queen side. Potentially they have some moves where they're trying to win this pawn even, which could go either way. But yeah, they're mostly sticking to the queen side, apart from one pawn break they could potentially do, which potentially could be a bit dubious for black, but it is the f6. And the whole idea of this is after you take and take, this pawn's super weak. Potentially, you even have some e6 push, e5 push as well. But yeah, this one's super interesting. It's definitely worth taking a look at, especially if you castle kingside. You're going to be immediately opening up your rook file as well. So potentially you could even launch an attack on the white king. But I'm sure anyone who plays the French does already sort of know this. A lot of the main lines do revolve around the pawn structures. So yeah, you do need to know this if you are planning on playing the French. It's super important. The f6 for black, the kingside attack for white, and the queenside pawn push as well. But yeah, super simple really. And I think that relates to a lot of the strong diagonals. This is sort of similar to the Carlsbad in a way, except for the pawn breaks really. You want to be sort of sticking to your side and sort of covering the other side as well slightly, but mostly just focusing on your sort of play yourself really. But yeah, on to the last one actually, I believe. So the last pawn structure we have here comes directly from the Caro-Kann, from the Panov, from the accelerated Panov. It can lead into this position, especially if you choose to push on c5 rather than take. Now this is a super interesting one as well. Both sides castling kingside because of the major weaknesses on each side. But for white, it's going to be all about the c-pawn, really. You want to try push this into a pass pawn, really, with some sort of supporting pushes from the b and a pawns. You want to be getting your rooks along these, and you need to be looking out for this d-pawn as well. However you do it, there is going to be some major pressure on this pawn, but the star of the show is really the c-pawn, and if you can make many threats by pushing it, really, supported with the pawns, it's like the opposite of a minority attack, really. It's the majority attack. You're going for the crushing pawn storm. But yeah, please don't forget to look after this d-pawn, because if you lose that, the game is practically over. That's your anchor, and yeah, just remember that. But the majority of the pawn breaks are coming from the black side as well. Mainly b6 and e5. Both are just looking at weakening these two connected pawns. So with b6, obviously if they push, both of these are going to be super weak. And if they take, then they've sort of just lost their attack. So it's a super interesting one. Potentially you even have a b5 as well. Just sort of stopping these supporting pawns from going any further, with potential of maybe like a fianchetto this way, although you're sort of blocking yourself in with these pawns, so maybe that's not the best idea. And with e5 as well, and the whole idea of e5 is to sort of go after this pawn, which we sort of said is important for white to keep, so you got to go after it yourself. Hit their anchor, really, and if they've not got an anchor, they're going to be drifting out to sea, you know. But yeah, and if you hit this as well, you're going to be weakening this even more. So you want to be getting your rooks, covering the c file. Your queen's got to be doing some job, potentially over here, whatever that is. The e5 is super strong. Even if you just trade this, yes, you're isolating your pawn, but this one's going to be so weak, you're going to be getting tons of compensation for it. And I would also recommend some sort of fianchetto as well. And you can see the point straight away, just going after this pawn. And once this one's gone, this bishop's going to be an absolute superstar, and you're going to be having a very good time. But yeah, I personally wouldn't be too comfortable with this sort of pawn structure as white. I would think this is just a liability. But there are tons of master games with this one as well. And a lot of them you can see how this pawn storm just ends up crushing black because it's super fast and super scary as well. But yeah, please check this one out. But yeah, I think that's the last little pawn structure we have for now. So few last words. So I hope you guys found that useful. I know it was a bit quick, but it's hard to sort of summarize pawn structures a lot because there are a lot of nuances in the position, sort of based around how the pieces react with the pawn structure. And the best way to go about doing that is with master games, looking through master games, grandmaster games, and seeing how they sort of deal with it, and sort of focusing on like the pawn breaks and how they are looking to clear paths with their pawns, which is way past my pay grade, to be honest. Who am I to be like analysing and criticising grandmasters? But there are tons of resources out there. Please, I urge you to go check this out. It will help your game so much. But yeah, for any sort of people that are new to pawn structures, I hope this helped. I hope this sort of motivated you to check this out at your own. And I hope you sort of start implementing these in your own games, and sort of it helps you build up making your sort of plans going into the middle game and the end game. But yeah, thank you all for watching. Please like if you liked. Please subscribe if you really liked. And I'll catch you guys all tomorrow. Bye bye.